there was the season of the scallop, there was the season of the crudo, and we laugh at it and we kind of make fun of it, but truthfully, it's because they're smart and they're limited in time, and that applies to the home kitchen too. When I have 20 minutes to make dinner and I want something that's impressive and beautiful and simple to cook, go for the scallop.
You're listening to the Taste Podcast. I'm Editor-in-Chief Matt Rodbard, here with Senior Editor Anna Hezel.
On today's show, we're talking to Gail Simmons, who is a judge on Top Chef and also the author of the recent cookbook, Bringing It Home. Later on the show, we'll be talking to Deb Perelman from Smitten Kitchen, who's going to answer a question from a reader. First of all, just what did you and Gail talk about in your conversation?
It was a really meaningful conversation, Anna. We talked about her world travels, living on a kibbutz in Israel, going to school in Montreal, her life on Top Chef. But I think near the end of the conversation, she talked about abuse in the kitchen. She's worked in several kitchens in New York, and she's really honest about the types of abuse she experienced, some of the abuse she did not experience. And I think her response was pretty surprising. So I think it's worth checking out.
Here's Gail Simmons talking to Matt at Books Are Magic in Brooklyn.
So I want to talk about the book. I got to look at it. I've had it for several weeks, and I've got to page through it. And I learned a lot about you in this book.
Personal.
Yeah, it is a personal book. So I learned about your honeymoon in Hanoi, searching for chocolate lavang, which I've done myself, but you did not actually end up going to chocolate lavang.
I failed. I cried on the street for 6 hours, maybe 12. And then I learned to make it myself because I couldn't ever get to the real place.
I learned you lived on a kibbutz. You're a kibbutznik. You lived there when you were in high school, right?
After my senior year of high school, I spent 2.5 months on a kibbutz in northern Israel near the Galilee. And I worked on a chicken farm, picking eggs, not slaughtering chickens, although we did have to kill some chickens when they would get sick only. But no, I was picking eggs, and then I was transferred to the kitchen, and that was the very first professional kitchen. Well, professional is sort of a
And you learned to make schnitzel with za'atar, which is the recipe in the book, which I think that's like one of the national dishes of Israel.
It really is. I mean, there's a lot of schnitzel in Israel because of so many Eastern European immigrants, obviously, when the country was founded, and they made schnitzel like every Sunday was family dinner night. Everyone eats communally every other day of the week, but on Sunday nights, everyone eats in their own homes with their families. And so we would be invited every different Sunday to a different family of friends that we'd made on the kibbutz. And they always made schnitzel, and my favorite was schnitzel with za'atar. So it's in the book.
So there's more. I've learned more. You went to school in Montreal. You're born in Toronto. But the Quebecois cuisine, like poutine and the rich braises.
Yes, there's a lot of... I grew up in Toronto, which is a very Anglophone city, obviously an English city, but I spent 4 years in Montreal. I married a Montrealer. My mother's from Montreal. And I sort of, I align, I don't know, in my head, I'm a Montrealer. That would offend a lot of my family. But somehow there's like 4 or 5 Quebecois dishes that showed up in my book. There's a pork and beans stew with maple cream, and they're all maple syrup recipes. We're a giant cliche, basically. The whole country, but there's a tarte au sucre, which is a very traditional maple sugar tart, and there's a pudding chomer, which is a maple and pear sort of sticky toffee pudding type dessert.
So I also learned about charcuterie garnie, right?
Yes.
Charcuterie garnie, an Alsatian dish, which you learned from Hubert Keller. Is that right?
Well, I learned about it. My mother actually made it when we were growing up.
Okay.
It's a very traditional dish in Alsace and in Austria, Germany sort of area. And it's actually a very complicated dish to make when you are in that part of the world, but I've simplified it. And I just call it sausage and sauerkraut so that people actually make it and aren't freaked out.
Man, I learned about peri-peri chicken. I learned about your lazy lobster pies that you make summers in Massachusetts.
That's right. I discovered a recipe for lazy lobster pie at a lobster shack that I go to all the time when we're there. And 2 years ago, when I went there to have it, it had changed hands. There'd be new owners, and there was no lazy lobster pie on the menu. So I made it myself.
You made it.
Because we all need lazy lobster pie in our lives.
So, Gail Simmons, you're a well-traveled individual. You've seen the world, not just through your life on television, but through through life. But you also had this great ability, and I think this is a big reason why this book is such a success, is that every recipe has been simplified, has been pared down to the essence of the dish. Every recipe is one page and there are no sub recipes, but you've been able to really fit in these traditional flavors. Like, how the heck did you do that?
Some of it was challenging. The difficulty ethically is that I wanted to maintain the integrity of the food I was cooking and not dumb it down. This is not like 6 ingredients in 20 minutes every, whatever, after school special meals. I wanted them to be full of flavor and I wanted them to feel sophisticated, but I also wanted to make sure that they were actually cookable and that, no sub recipes. Not that I'm against sub recipes, but this is a home cook book. It's not a chef book. And I wanted people to take it into their kitchens and actually use it and not feel intimidated by it at any level. So there are a few recipes that are a little more complicated, a little more of a challenge. But really, I just wanted people to cook from them and to use the recipes, but still make sure that I was maintaining the authenticity of the flavors from
that word is crazy.
Came.
Authenticity, man. That's a crazy word. And I think
it's a scary word these days. It's an important word these days.
Yeah. Did you feel challenged to justify this international cookbook? Did you feel that was...
I didn't set out necessarily saying I was writing an international cookbook. I always sort of pitched it or imagined it as a book about my adventures in food. And I've been lucky enough to do a lot of travel, even from a young age. My parents were great travelers. My father's from South Africa. My mother's from Montreal, but lived in Europe and Israel growing up. So we always traveled a ton as children, and that was always important to my parents and then, in turn, important to me. So it sort of happened naturally, and it's an amalgamation of dishes that I love to cook. But the great thing about living in a city like New York is that you can have access to every ingredient and every ethnicity and every cuisine at your fingertips, and you can eat Vietnamese for breakfast and Japanese for lunch and Mexican for dinner and then 16 other snacks in between. And so I think it's very much a reflection of how we all eat now.
Yeah, definitely. I think one part too we need to really focus in about this book. It's not just an international cookbook. It's about cooking at home and getting people into the kitchen. And I thought chef lessons worth bringing home. You offer 15 of them in the book. I want to go through a couple of these. So let's say number 1, mise en place is everything. Now I must say the word mise en place is challenging. Is that too chefy? But
you can sound a bit pretentious
snobby,
using
mise en
it.
place. But explain what you mean by that, because it's your first fundamental rule, and I think it's really important to know as a home cook.
I think that the whole section actually was not in my original proposal for the book. When I sat down with my editor at Grand Central, she wanted to bring more Top Chef into the book because obviously that's a big platform and a big piece of my life. But we wanted to do it so that it felt organic to me and about learning to cook, because I think the most amazing thing about being on the show for 12 years of my life, I was 4 when we started making the show. I get younger every time I say that, by the way. Is that I've learned a lot. I've grown a lot, and I've learned so much about cooking. And I started on the show because I was a cook and I was a food writer and I was working at Food Wine magazine. So I had some experience. Obviously, they didn't just choose me otherwise. But in those 12 years, watching so many talented chefs cook, sitting at the table with such extraordinary talent and the breadth of talent we've had on the show, I've learned so much about cooking. So these 15 lessons actually are all sort of lessons that you hear on the show, that you hear us talk about, that you hear us tell the chefs, but they're all completely applicable to the home kitchen. And people don't associate that. People, I think, watch the show and think this is just... it's chefy chef talk and it doesn't really apply to me, but it's cool and it sounds neat. But really everything we talk about, including mise en place, which is really just being organized in the kitchen, is such a crucial lesson.
Organization tactic.
Right. It's about the idea of preparing yourself before you start cooking, which will ultimately set you up for success.
With the tiny little bowls, you do
right.
that?
Yeah, you can do the tiny little bowls, but you also don't need to be precious about it when you're in your home kitchen. Pile it up on your cutting board. Or
completely agree.
If you know that a few things are going into the pot at the same time, you can put them all in one bowl. But the fact that, the point is read the recipe through, prepare, and know what step is coming next and have everything set up, especially because there's a lot of recipes in the book where at the very end things come together quickly. So if you don't read through and know that that's about to happen, then it'll be more complicated at the end.
Lesson number 4. have a salt strategy.
Yes.
I love that. That's Samin Nosat was here, who wrote a great book about salt, acid, heat.
Yes.
She writes extensively, but you also touch on it. Talk about salt.
I mean, seasoning, again, we always talk about seasoning on the show. Any cook will talk to you about how important it is to season your food properly. But seasoning your food isn't just kind of adding salt at one time. It's thinking about adding salt throughout the recipe, but in small increments, depending on obviously the steps of the recipe, so that you are seasoning thoughtfully and consistently, so that at the end, you don't necessarily have to just keep throwing salt in and can't figure out why it's tasting superficial and it doesn't have the depth that it has. So I talk about different ways of salting different recipes. So when you're making a soup, you might salt at the very beginning, and then you're going to salt in the middle after you reduce it, and then you're going to salt it at the end when you're doing that final taste. Or when you're salting a salad or finishing a dish, why putting a little salt on after it's finished cooking, as well as before you cook it, is important, but to do it judiciously.
And do you have kosher salt on hand at all times? Do you have Malden
Yes.
salt? Do you have,
You know what?
what do you
always,
like to have?
I generally like to have two salts, a kosher salt that I cook with ubiquitously, and then a fancier, coarser salt, flakier salt like Malden salt, or a Sel Gris for finishing certain things at the end. But I don't think that that's necessary for home cooks. Buy a big box of kosher salt and start there. And I think kosher salt is great because of its texture. You know, it's coarse and it's easy to feel and understand. Fine salt is hard to cook with because you can't control it as easily.
Now on to 5. Know when a dish needs acid. That's like the next part.
Yes.
Like salt and acid work
Right.
off each other. So what does that mean? Like acid is important to balance out the salt that you maybe have
That's
oversalted?
exactly right. It's important to balance out salt. It's important to balance out fat. People hear this on the show all the time. And in fact, Tom Colicchio and I often joke about how we've somehow created a generation of total monsters because we go to restaurants and we're sitting at our table just like leisurely enjoying our meal, and we can hear this young person at the table next to us saying, "Oh my God, this dish needs acid." And we've totally, it's his fault. I'm going to blame it on Tom Colicchio. And not only him, but, you know, this kind of the cooking show.
The jargon is now part of our life.
Right, everyone, but it's true. And acid can come in many forms, vinegar, citrus, obviously. And it does play a really important role in the cooking process. Not that every single dish you make needs tons of lemon juice or vinegar or, you know, pickle brine, although I do put a lot of pickle juice in my recipes. Like 5 or 6 recipes in the book have pickle juice. It's a good ingredient.
So you just always like keep the pickle jar and keep the juice in the
It's
container,
like liquid gold, that stuff. Pickle juice. If you take nothing else away tonight.
It's a great brine.
But it does, I do think it adds dimension and it brightens the dishes that you cook. And in my in my book, you'll see throughout the book many different uses of different acids and how to implement them easily and just make everything tastier.
Lesson 10, maybe they should call it Top Scallop. And I think it's like a callback to like a season 2 of Top Chef.
Season 5, but there's been a lot of
the
seasons.
earlier season.
Yes, old school Top Chef.
Old school Top Chef. But you're referring to the scallop as being this like really, really important and versatile ingredient that you can find in most grocery stores.
Right. There's always every season, you know, there was the season of the scallop, there was the season of the crudo, and people laugh at that, and people always ask me, God, why do the chefs always make a crudo? And we laugh at it and we kind of make fun of it. But truthfully, it's because they're smart and they're limited in time. And that applies to the home kitchen too. When I have 20 minutes to make dinner and I want something that's impressive and beautiful and simple to cook, go for the scallop. I mean, get good quality scallops, buy them from a source that you trust.
Can you smell them? Like, how do you
Sure,
know?
you can smell them. They should not look dry.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be dry. So there's a difference between a dry scallop and a wet scallop. You want to buy a dry scallop in that it hasn't been treated with chemicals that actually preserve it and weigh it down. So it will weigh more, which means it will cost more. But it also will exude a lot of liquid when you put it in a pan, and it's often waterlogged. So you want to ask to make sure that scallops are dry, but they shouldn't be dried out physically. They should look moist and fresh. They should smell briny, but not fishy. Yeah. And scallops, things like scallops or quick cooking seafood, almost all seafood, is a great choice when you need to think on your feet, cook quickly, and it's sort of a blank canvas for a million flavors.
Lesson 13, the final lesson but there's like 15 of them. So know how to make one great dessert. So what is that one great dessert for you? I think that's good advice.
There's a couple desserts that I sort of rely on. There's a banoffee pie in my book that's a chocolate wafer crust with dulce de leche and bananas and whipped cream and roasted peanuts, and it requires zero cooking, but it looks incredible. So the sort of joke of that lesson is that most chefs are not pastry chefs. They're very different kitchens, and people always talk about why can't the chefs on Top Chef make desserts? And truthfully, there's a big difference.
Another show? Wasn't that like the
yes,
other
we did. It was a whole show. 2 seasons was canceled, but it was really good.
Yeah, it shows how much people care about desserts.
I ate a lot of cupcakes on that show. The truth is, making pastry and making dessert are two different things, and making pastry is an art and a craft unto itself. But making dessert doesn't need to be complicated and stressful. In fact, I have a dessert that's just grilled pineapple with molasses and lime zest, and you're done, right? Or, there's like 5 or 6 desserts in my book that require no baking skill, and you don't even have to turn your oven on. So I just think that it's not I'm always amazed on the show. Like, really, you didn't come here with one dessert? You can do better than that. And I think we all can do better than that.
There's got to be like a Top Chef for Dummies like email or shared doc that goes around.
I wish we were allowed to just send them do me a favor, make it easy on us this season. Here are the top 10 things. Well, maybe I'll just send them all my book now.
So we're in a bookstore. I always like to ask about books, and you call out 2 books that really meant a lot to you. So one is the Moosewood Bible.
Oh, yeah.
So talk about the importance of that book and when it came into your life.
So, dirty little secret, when I was probably 15 until I was 21, I was a vegetarian.
Figured so.
For many reasons, and all noble. And I'm no longer a vegetarian, but at the time, that was also the same time that I started cooking in earnest. And I was at college, and my mother was an amazing cook, and I would lug things home from Toronto to Montreal every time I went to visit her, and her recipes, and call her at all hours of the day and night getting recipes from her. And the first book that I bought for myself, cookbook, at a secondhand bookstore in Montreal, was the Moosewood Bible. And Molly Katzen was sort of a trailblazer in the 70s and 80s, making amazing, at the time, really dynamic vegetarian food. And so that was the first book I really cooked from, and splattered the pages, and came home and, made butternut squash soup for the first time.
Did you make the moussaka?
No, it's funny that everyone makes the moussaka. No, yeah. I don't remember ever making the moussaka.
It's good.
But that sounds good.
So good.
And it's still on my shelf, and it's still a great book to reference for a lot of things.
And the other book is Jeffrey Steingarten's The Man Who Ate Everything.
Yes.
Is that right how you say it? Being a badass critic, basically, is like what that guy taught everyone in food writing to do. So you read that book, but you didn't just love that book. You wanted to work with Jeffrey. Like you found this guy was going to be a mentor to you, right? Is that
someone gave me this book to read, and I read it in like 2 sittings, and it quite literally changed my life. It sounds very dramatic, but I was just about ready to leave the kitchen. I knew I wanted to write about food, and I was trying to figure out what the next steps would be. And I read this book, and a light went on. This is what I wanted to be. Not Jeffrey, because no one was going to be Jeffrey. Jeffrey is this mad scientist. He is I believe, one of the greatest food writers of our time. And what I wanted to be was his assistant. And I read this book, and in the book, he talks about his assistants at the time, a woman named Catherine and a woman named Tara. And in the book, they are running to the market one day to buy exotic ingredients, and then they're doing research at the New York Public Library, and then they're spending a month in the kitchen perfecting a recipe for him. And this was the job. And I didn't know that this job actually existed. So I went to my culinary school career counselor with the book, as if I was the first person to discover this book. And I was like, do you know this book? Because this is what I want to do. This is the man. I want to work for someone like Jeffrey. And his response was, I bumped into him last week, and his assistant, Catherine, is leaving, and he's looking for a new assistant. And so that was that was a Wednesday, and I interviewed on the Friday, and I got the job on the Monday. I don't know how I got the job, because the interview was so stressful. He made me translate from Spanish and French. He made me translate a French cookbook by Ducasse, the original Il Bulli cookbook in Spanish. He made me do translation because it said on my resume that I speak French and Spanish. So note to self, when you put that on your resume, you better effing be able to prove it. He made me taste these Brazilian ribs that he was cooking at the time. I had to taste wine and give tasting notes. There were so many moments. He asked me what my favorite restaurants were in New York.
Answer at the time?
Well, this was the thing. I was a line cook. I had no money. I wasn't going to fancy restaurants, but I had just eaten at this sushi restaurant in the Village called Tomo, I think. Is it still there?
Yeah, Greenwich Village. Oh, yeah.
Remember that place? Yeah. And that was like a big deal for me. And I blew a week's pay on that sushi restaurant. So I told him, Tomo. And he said, you don't read Vogue magazine, do you? And I was like, why? What do you mean? He had just written a huge article about how it was the crappiest sushi restaurant in America. So I was like, all right, that's it. Life is great. I got 3 hours with Jeffrey Steingarten. I can go back to Canada happy. I have fulfilled my New York story. And somehow he let me have the job.
Tell me about these errands, because you write about it in your book and you refer to it in his book, but you were a gopher, an intern, an assistant.
Do everything. So, I did all of those things. We made coq au vin for 3 months.
The key to coq au vin is what? Because you write about this.
Is old roosters.
Old roosters.
That's the coq. The whole point was, I guess, in French farmsteads, what to do when you have all these old roosters that can't produce and can't procreate anymore. And what do you make with them? Because they're really tough and they're old. So you brine them in wine, you soak them in wine to soften them, and you make a really rich stew. And so he set out to make authentic coq au vin, and so we needed to find a lot of roosters. And so my job was to procure roosters from a chicken farm in Queens for a long time. And we had this delivery of old roosters. They were dead every day because it's sort of a 3-day process. And actually that was what we were making over 9/11. The chefs at Balthazar at the time were organizing trucks of food to go down to the rescue workers. And so every day I would bring vats of coq au vin to them, and they would send them down to the rescue workers at 9/11 for 9/11, at the tower.
So you take a lot of pilgrimages in this book. You're talking about, so let's talk about the idea of the pilgrimage, the food pilgrimage. What makes the perfect or a great food pilgrimage?
I don't know. It's interesting. I'm conflicted about this a little bit. So many of us travel for food, and we have a list of places we have to go when we go to different cities. But then if you don't go, then you're sort of there's a shaming process of you couldn't get in, or how do you do it, and and this sort of social media frenzy around having to go to the place.
Currency, it's cultural currency.
It is cultural
our
currency.
Instagram accounts are cultural currency.
Absolutely. So the lesson of Choco Lavong, the lesson in Vietnam when I tried to go to this restaurant many times and failed and lost my mind about it, was that I have to be a little looser about the bucket list. So I love making food pilgrimages, but they also set expectations really high. And what I think I love about food discovery travel of all kinds is that it really is about the path. This is cliche, but the path less taken, in that place that you find that you don't anticipate, or that you weren't planning 2 months in advance to eat at or to go to. And those become the most memorable meals because they were surprises on the road. Or, there's many recipes in my book. I have a ribollita recipe, simple Italian bread and bean vegetable soup recipe, which came out of when my husband and I were in Italy many years ago, and we were meeting my father in Siena, and at the cathedral there at the Duomo, and it was pouring rain, and like buckets, sheets of rain, and we were caught in the rain, so we ducked into this total dive bar just to get out of the rain and have a glass of wine and wait it out before we could go find my father. And this place, all they had on the menu were 3 things. One of them was ribollita, and they served us this soup. It was so satisfying and so, completely comforting and delicious and hearty and flavorful that I never forgot it, and went home and started making ribollita. And so this very simple soup is now so important to me. And that kind of became a pilgrimage without knowing it.
You can't plan that.
Right.
I wanted to ask a final question, and you worked at Le Cirque 2000, you worked at Vong, you worked at many restaurants. There's been a lot reported recently about Smitten Kitchens. It's an unfolding story. Everyone's in this room.
This is a big question for the last question, but I'm ready for it.
So tell me, Gail, did you experience abuse in the kitchen?
It's an important thing to think about. It's due time that we think about it a lot more. Kitchens have always, I have a lot to say about this. I'm going to try and keep it brief. I wasn't treated well necessarily. There were many times when I was, I hurt myself on the line and I was told to take it like a man. There were times when I certainly was chastised because I couldn't lift the heavy pots or, I couldn't complete a task as quickly as the other cooks could. But I never, ever processed it as abuse. I don't think that I was abused. And I think that it's due time that kitchens are run like businesses, because restaurants are businesses, and corporations need to have systems, and companies need to have systems, and they need to have places where you feel safe going to work every day, no matter who you are, no matter where you're from, no matter your gender. And so I'm glad that we're at a moment where we can talk about these things a little more openly and think about the way that kitchens are structured and the way that we treat employees, and not just kitchen employees, but front of house employees, administrative employees, because for some reason restaurants have always sort of imagined themselves outside the scope of business. People forget that restaurants are businesses. But they have negated, I think, often the traditional systems and operations.
Human resources,
operations. And that's not all kitchens. It's an exaggeration to think that all kitchens are like that. I worked for Daniel Boulud for 3 years, and he, when I started working for him, he had 3 big kitchens in New York, and now he has something like 11. And I'm not saying they were easy kitchens, and they certainly, the male-female ratio was 10-1, but there was a respect in the kitchen, and I think that was from the top down. And I think that that's the only way that things will really change, is if the male leaders in the industry make change. And it's one thing for female chefs to write about it and scream it from the hilltops and talk about it, but there needs to be more male leaders coming forward to speak openly about it and to implement change in their restaurants. But I also think that there's a lot of reasons why they aren't. I think that a lot of them are scared, not because they're guilty of horrendous things, but because they probably don't know exactly and aren't in control exactly of how all their kitchens are run. So, there's a lot of factors, but I also think that there's a lot of chefs who do it right. And there's a lot of great chefs, great male chefs who are setting great examples in kitchens and who are running well-run, well-respected kitchens.
Well, I think the conversation is starting to open up. And I really appreciate you speaking publicly about this, because not enough people are doing it. I totally agree.
It's a big conversation. This is it's a weird thing to say, but sometimes I feel this sort of survivor's guilt, because I feel like I should also be telling stories of how I was abused in a kitchen, but I wasn't, or I don't feel that. And now I feel sort of maybe guilty that should I be speaking out more? And I'm still sort of finding my path with, if I have a platform to speak out about it, how I do so properly and respectfully as well, without alienating people.
I mean, this is a start.
Yeah.
But I'm going to wrap it up and say thank you, Gail, for coming here and being awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
In our next segment, we are talking to Deb Perelman of Smitten Kitchen and asking her a question from a reader.
Deb Perelman, we're here in your kitchen in New York City. We have a reader question. So if you were to write an entire cookbook based on one ingredient, what would that one ingredient be?
Oh, my goodness. I'm like, artichokes? But no, they're not that versatile. They're
so
just
much
my
subtext
favorite.
with artichokes, too. I feel like you'd have to have all these weird jokes.
No, because I don't think they're the most... usable thing. And I also like to eat them fairly plain. So, oh my goodness, I should, Could I do a popcorn cookbook?
Yes, you can. Let's go there. I love that.
Popcorn. I'm going to do a popcorn cookbook.
Right.
I don't know what 100 things I'm going to do with it, but I have a few
You
ideas.
could do 55 and maybe do a little bit of front matter and have a little back. You'll sell it for like $12.95. You'll do really well. So let's talk about this popcorn cookbook.
Oh no, I should have spent more time thinking about
So your
this.
agent, I'm like your agent. I'm here sitting here, and we're talking about this popcorn cookbook. What is this popcorn cookbook all about? Like, how do you love to make popcorn? What's your first popcorn recipe?
My first popcorn recipe would be, I love the kale pecorino popcorn in my new book. I know that's like so on. It's like, just call it cacio e pepe with kale in it, and you've got all the all the trends of 2 years ago in one place. I love the idea of doing it like simple preparations, but I also actually like in my first cookbook I have a buttered popcorn cookie. So I just kind of like the idea of using it as like a crunch factor in other things. And I also have always wanted to make a caramel corn cake, like party cake. I have an idea.
So you're going like ways to incorporate popcorn into more
that's
dishes.
where I'm going to start. I think I would start there. And I also, I've done this sort of like buffalo chicken popcorn before. It's basically like part hot sauce, part butter. And then you can serve it like with blue cheese. So that was like 5 things right there. You can buy this idea from me.
We're doing the table of contents right now. Were you a microwave popcorn person growing up, or did you always do stovetop, or did you do those cool machines?
So we did microwave air pop. We had this air popper, and it was funny because I just saw one of them recently at like Williams-Sonoma. I'm like, oh, are these coming back? Is this my childhood? But you could do like no oil. I would definitely add butter at the end, but like for popping, it was just very clean and simple. So it was just an air popper. And then as an adult, I would do it on the stove, but somebody for Christmas this year got us an air popper, and like it looks like an old-fashioned machine, and like whenever the kids see it, they're like, popcorn, I want popcorn. And it's very easy because you just throw the corn in, and it just
Well, I can't wait to read your popcorn book in 2021. Taste might publish it. We're just gonna maybe just throw that out there.
We're just gonna do a single subject. We're gonna give where do those people do the
Short stack?
Short stack.
Yeah.
You're gonna give them a run for their money.
You heard it here first. Well, thanks, Deb. Appreciate it. The Taste Podcast is hosted by Anna Hezel and myself, Matt Rodbard. It is produced by Gabrielle Lewis. Our theme music is by Steve Rydell. Interviews are recorded live at Books Are Magic in Cobble Hill, Brooklyn. Special thanks to Books Are Magic fam Michael, Mike, and Emma. Confidence wine supplied by Smith & Vine. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com and see you next week.